right. Fifth time is the charm. If this doesn't work, this fifth time that I'm trying to film this video, then it'll be faster for me just to call all of you individually and tell you everything I want to say in this video. But anyway, let's dig in. We are almost done with our time in Austin, and one of the things I've committed to doing while being in each of these cities is learning about its history. So I want to fill you in. I'm going to tell you some interesting things I thought, at least, about Austin history. So it starts, like much of American history, with Native Americans on this land. So Apache, Comanche, and the Tonkawa were the different tribes that all lived in modern-day Austin. Or I should say in the land that is now modern-day Austin, of course. I didn't learn as much about the tribes as I wanted to, but I still plan to. What I did listen to was a really interesting podcast talking about the roadways in Austin and how many of those are paths that were originally Native American paths. It sounds like Native American paths kind of turn into the trail paths for those with wagons, which then turn into the automobile paths, which then turn to our highways. So this is not a super uncommon thing, I would imagine, in other cities, but nonetheless, that history is here in Austin, which is interesting. Most of the history books in Austin start in like the 1830s, so right around when Texas is becoming a country and Austin is becoming potentially the capital of Texas. Apparently this was like a decades-long battle to make Austin the capital. I didn't finish reading the book all about that, so I really can't tell you that much. I do know it is the capital today, and Mirabeau Lamar, who was the second president of Texas, was one of the foremost people in trying to push Austin as the capital for, of course, the country of Texas that then became the state of Texas. The Capitol building itself is super impressive. It's nearly as tall, the building itself, as the U.S. Capitol, but is on a higher elevation, so it's technically higher than the U.S. Capitol, which seems like a very Texas thing to do. It's a really beautiful building inside. I didn't get any cool drone shots of it because the day I was there was just a few weeks after the whole political unrest situation, and there was 100 National Guardsmen, and I just didn't really want them shooting my drone down. So this is the video you get. Nonetheless, that happened in the early 1800s. I want to actually jump to like the later 1800s. I learned, oddly, a lot about this time period, partially because I read a book about America's first serial killer who was in Austin in the late 1800s. They mostly killed black servant women. Of course, the police didn't get involved until they killed a couple white women. Typical America. But they were never caught. There's actually rumors that Jack the Ripper in London, who was just a few years after the serial killer in Austin, was that same person. We'll never know. Also, around the same time in the 1800s, the University of Texas was founded in Austin. So up until that point, it had been a very government-run economy. Now, education and a little bit of that like science and innovation was coming into Austin, and the city wanted to be even more than that. So, of course, to become a industrial capital, they would have to have some source of energy. That's why they decided to build a dam. As I've mentioned a couple times, there's a Colorado River that runs straight through Austin. So at a part in that river, they started building a dam. It was finished again in the late 1800s. Tons of taxpayer dollars and time and effort put into this. The idea was to power some cotton mills right along the river that would turn into a whole industry. It also powered these things called moonlight towers, which were Austin's first streetlights. I don't think it's a total coincidence that they started appearing again around the same time as the serial killer, but there were probably other reasons. This style of streetlight, this moonlight tower, was actually going out of popularity around that time, so I never figured out why exactly Austin stuck with it. I guess Detroit was one other city that had these types of towers. But today, Austin is the only city in the country that still has any of these left, and they have 20 some, so maybe a couple dozen. Also powered at that time was a streetcar. Austin no longer has a streetcar, sadly, but that enabled the first suburb of Austin, which is now like a relatively central city neighborhood. It's called Hyde Park, but back then you needed a streetcar to get there, and again, it was helping with this expansion of Austin. Now, the dam didn't live up to its promises. It simply was not reliable enough to power all of those things, so that cotton mill industry never appeared. And then in 1900, there was a giant storm and the dam broke. Of course, it didn't get rebuilt until 1940 because of all sorts of bureaucratical reasons, it sounds like. At that point, there were dams like further upriver that were then powering the city of Austin. So it's the dam that's there now, and it's interesting to look at and interesting to think about what the history of Austin would have been if, maybe it had stuck around, or maybe it had been a little bit more powerful, how different Austin might have looked. So, jumping further into the 1900s, Austin, of course, is known now for its music and art scene. Again, that's something I didn't dig into as much as I could have, but you can definitely see how it's shaped the city and the culture here. I actually started reading a fictional book called Waterloo, a novel, which Waterloo was an original name of Austin before it was called Austin. There's lots of things around Austin that are named Waterloo, like sparkling water brands or record stores. Anyway, this novel called Waterloo had a really kind of poetic way of explaining realistically Austin, but the city that they named Waterloo in the book. So I just want to read that to you. This provincial capital, known for its friendly, laid-back atmosphere and vibrant local music scene, is nestled between Blackland Prairie to the southeast and Limestone Plateau to the north and west. The Alameda River dips below the center of town like a fat man's belt. The city is home to the state's flagship university and its governing assembly. Surrounded by attractive hills and spring-fed streams, Waterloo is regarded as a pleasant city by locals and visitors alike. Its climate, however, is often unpleasant. In most years, a thick, hot haze descends upon the region in mid-April and suffocates the populace until late October. A north-south interstate highway, built 50 years ago and annually responsible for dozens of traffic deaths, divides the city. Poor sections to the east, downtown to the west. Farther west are violet hills that used to afford genial vistas of the town, before the smog and subdivisions arrived. From the hills, it is possible to view the city overall and draw therefrom an impression of sweet curving streets and gentle sweeping lawns, and the unequivocally happy sound of children always at play, a writer once observed. Closer on, he continued, the feeling is only partly confirmed, though it should seem enough to have even a part. That writer died in 1978. The majority of Waterloo's residents don't bother themselves with the city's history, such as it is. During the early year of the Republic, there was much debate over where to locate the capital, until a commission of the region's gouty elder statesmen chose Waterloo, a frontier encampment, over a more civilized but fever-prone arrival on the coast. The encampment became a town, and the pioneers arrived, full of grand ideas. But they soon discovered that the thin soils were inhospitable to their more ambitious schemes. They settled. They suppressed their fantasies and consoled themselves with books, music, and ale. Waterloo grew to be a center of learning, a good town for live entertainment, an incubator of laziness. Rather than visionaries, the city would eventually harbor state legislators and musicians, two populations who, despite their very different styles of dress, were united in their desires not to have to work too hard, to be locally renowned, and to drink beer paid for by somebody else. In this, they were generally content, though when the weather shifted, one could occasionally catch a whiff of old buried ambitions. Only then, only after Waterloo had spent more than 100 years wallowing in the sun, was it hit by boom times, much as this ran counter to its indigenous spirit. At the turn of the 21st century, the city sprung an economy like a leak, like a tear in the cloud cover, and money poured in. Into new enterprises created with the toss of a wrist, a couple keystrokes. High technology sent in its conquistadors. Builders rushed into action. The air grew thick with sawdust and receipts. And the poor old musicians, the state employees, the bookstore clerks, they stumbled through the malls and office parks, bewildered, uneasy, cursing under their breath, hoping that some portion of the windfall might find its way into their own ragged pockets, yet forever wishing it had all turned out differently. They couldn't help themselves. If you've reached this point in the video and are wondering whether this is about to become a history channel and you should unsubscribe, let me tell you why it is actually relevant. We think the history of a place is important. We're white tech workers that will be seen as gentrifiers, or at best, raising the housing prices. And while we can't prevent being seen that way, and we can't really prevent actually raising housing prices, we can do our best to understand the culture of a place we're going to live. Anywhere we move is going to have history, good and bad, and anywhere is going to have problems, good and bad. It's just that the history informs what kind of problems and what kind of amazing things you're going to find in any city. So we want to be aware of that. Not to try to avoid the bad things, but just to be informed residents. Anyway, thanks for watching. Ben and I will be leaving Austin soon, and of course making more updates about our travels and hopefully one about our final assessment of Austin itself. This is me talking, and I really hope that this actually works. I'm a little further away. I don't know how this is, but it is a way for me to talk to you. Testing again. Does the video actually work on this mode? I want to be less blurry. Alright, test number 8 million. Am I blurry or not? Started turned around. Now you're looking at a face. Is this a problem? Is this a problem for you? Now you're probably seeing up my nose. This doesn't seem blurry. Why are you only blurry when it's my face? My face is just blurry in real life. That's what it is. Hi. I've tried to film this video 4 times. I'll do an outtakes video someday when I'm not sick of making videos. So, cheers.